what we're going to try to do is sort of impromptu. Maybe Greg and I will try to summarize some of the things that we've heard over the last couple of days, so we can close with a little bit of a summary. I think over the last couple of days, I think there is, as I mentioned, there seems to be an evolution of the role of the various players in the ecosystem. I see the government more and more being limited in the production of a very secure and valuable document, but the private sector coming in and consuming that document and then creating a derived identity. So the concept of derivative identity is becoming important. We saw a lot of NFC, a lot of people saying, well, I'm gonna put this against my smartphone, and then I recover some of the information that becomes reliable information because it came from a reliable credential, reliable document. I also, another possibility is for an identity portal, which we heard a lot about, will connect to a government database, driver's license database or national ID database, like Verify Me, for example, with NIMSI in Nigeria. It can reach out to the database and validate that this is indeed exists. This is the person who they claim to be. And so, but at that point in time, from that point onward, that's a derived identity, that's a derived token that is acceptable and can be moving forward. So we're seeing the emergence of new roles for new players from the private sector. And by that, I mean, not just the industry that produces the technology, like we've been hearing over the last couple of days, that is enabling that. We're basically also understanding more and more that people are looking for useful identity. This is important. People want their identity to do things for them. In fact, yesterday I was struck by a statement from a Thales presentation where basically somebody saying it was almost passive boycott. You put up a program in place, and then there were people who were passively boycotting the identity program. And when you ask the question why, it's because they said it's not useful. It doesn't do anything for me that I cannot do today. And that's changing. Now that's changing because in the digital context, we're seeing identity being useful is very important. And before you jump in and say, well, are you saying legal identity is not important? Legal identity is very important. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying in that regard, because legal identity gives me certain rights that I cannot get with digital identity. Legal identity gives me the right to vote. That's a useful function. Gives me the right to travel. That's a useful function. So you can't just simply say, oh, because it's digital identity, it's not important, it's more important than legal identity. And by the way, digital identity could be digital link to legal identity. So the source is important and will ultimately dictate what the derived identity can or cannot do. But at the end of the day, we need to focus on usefulness of identity. So we've also had this contact versus contactless debate all across. There was a lot of people talking about the use of contactless. I'm not ready to write off the contact world. I'm not ready to say this is dead, this is not dead. And I can tell you why. One message which repeatedly came across from the sessions was in the world we live in, we don't just touch one tiny thing called the sensor. We touch so many things in the public. We touch tables, we touch doorknobs, So if you're basically going to say, well, you got sick because you touched the sensor, that means that we're building the wrong hygiene. That means we're building the wrong hygiene because you may have a face recognition in a room where you entered and you touched things. So at the end of the day, that's not the right solution. Legacy systems in Africa continue to rely on fingerprints. And therefore, we need to be able to leverage, whether it's contact legacy or adding new dimensions which are contactless. So I think I'm seeing a lot of forward-looking and future-proof technologies coming in. But the important thing not to forget in Africa, the legacy compatibility. We've just heard also on the panel, people saying, we have sometimes the infrastructure is not enough. We have to be compatible with feature phones instead of just smartphones. So the contactless debate took place in ID for Africa this week, but I can tell you there was not a clear-cut knockout. We see more important roles for face recognition and more important roles for iris, but fingerprint continues to be an important modality and dimension. Actually, one application that struck me about face recognition, which I'll share with you, was the application where you use face for activating an ID. So, you enroll, you go to a place, you enroll, etc. Then the issuance happens. But the question is, between the issuance and you arriving to have this in your hand, there is a possibility that in the mail or in the distribution process, it can get lost. And so what a wonderful application would be to basically use face recognition to say to people, okay, you want to activate this, you use face recognition to do a selfie and activate. Of course, that assumes that you have a phone with a selfie. So that was one thing that I took as a take-home message, as an important one. Digital onboarding was everywhere. Basically, NFC, digital onboarding, cloud, etc. We saw that. We heard a lot about governments being under pressure to catch up with expectations to offer digital services to people. We heard a lot about the credential chain, that now there is downstream identity, which is derived. We talked about that in a minute. And then the level of trust depends on the level of the original source, but also the transformation chain. If somewhere along the chain, that chain of trust got interrupted, then the identity level the identity trust can go down. I was very surprised, I have to share with you, that not much was said about interoperability. I think if the industry believed that interoperability was the most important driver, we would have heard it everywhere. We would have heard them say, well, my product interoperates with everybody else. I think that was not a message that I've heard. I heard that, we've got a solution end to end, but I think we need to revisit that in 2021, the question of interoperability. Smart ID in the past used to mean a smart card. Now, smart ID, when I hear that, it means an identity, digital identity held in a smart fashion, either in a smart portion of a device or over the cloud. We talked about the idea of mobile as a driver of development. Let us hope in the future that Africa will resolve its infrastructure issues and will have more and more mobile devices to give access. SIM registration was also an important element. We see that people have succeeded in running programs. Tanzania, for example, in a recent episode of the livecast, we've heard about how they motivated people to come and register by having the SIM tied to the identity number. Another thing that I heard was not one size fits all. That was the message that we got. Different. You want to enroll in an office, you want to enroll in a field, you want to enroll on board, different enrollment mechanism, different use. There is no one size fit all. You've got to analyze what your population's expectations are, what your infrastructure is, and what the applications that you want to support. And then you have a portfolio. Luckily, what you saw yesterday was plethora, plenty of ideas, plenty of solutions. The marketplace is healthy. It's not dominated by anyone, like I said before. And basically, it bodes well for customers because that means competition will drive prices and choice will drive prices. So I have other things, but let me stop here. Greg, let me invite you. Did you hear other things that I have not mentioned in this list? I know we've talked about this.
I think the thing that let me just check. I think the thing that I heard that sparked my interest, because I heard it more than once, was the idea of, I guess it's kind of a tokenization, the tokenization of biometrics so that biometrics could be used digitally. I'm not sure whether tokenization or hashing is the word, but that's what led me to think about this idea of tokenization. And I think that's something that I'm surprised in retrospect that we didn't hear more about that. But I think this subject of tokenization is going to come back for digital identity, because if we're going to pursue digital identity, as you and I just talked about here with other people, I think I think that's definitely something that's required. I think the issue of, you know, the tremendous focus on mobile now. Yeah, I think we have to. I'm not sure if I should go back and correct what I said earlier on in this fishbowl. I said, well, we have to look forward. We have to look forward because there are going to be more and more smartphones. But okay, maybe we're leaving a lot of people out of that, and we still need to look at solutions that are closer, perhaps, to payment transactions using USSD, like M-Pesa.
Right.
And when I think about it, all the way through this 3 days of technology demonstrations and showcases by vendors from all over the world, I don't remember seeing a single one of them that was using feature phones. And I mentioned earlier on that when I go to India, I usually see a few. I'm not saying that there are a lot of them, but I always see a few there. I mean, they're either focused on identity or payments, but there are people there still looking at the idea of doing things with feature phones. And I think perhaps some of the vendors, some of the suppliers and solutions providers that spoke over the last few days, if they're interested in Africa, they're going to have to look on both sides of the fence. I think that's what I would say.
In fact, that's great. I actually, over the last 3 days, I accumulated word frequency. I just collected some words and I made the top 10 words that I've heard over the last 3 days. And before we move on and welcome another guest on the Community Voices, let me share those words with you because they could be relevant. These are the top 10 words that I've heard over the last 3 days: inclusion, privacy, standards, tokens, usefulness, convenience, trust, centralized versus non-centralized, smart ID, and legacy. So these are the top 10 words that have occurred in the last 3 days regarding what the discussions are and around what topics they are. So maybe that's a topic we can discuss. But first we do that, Mikhail, thank you so much. Please introduce yourself and unmute yourself. Welcome.
I'm just checking. Can everybody see me and hear me?
Yes, we can see you loud and clear, and you've got a beautiful city behind you.
Yes, welcome everyone. My name is Michiel van der Veen. I'm calling from The Hague, from the Ministry of the Interior. I have 2 points to bring in, Joseph. One is on the inclusion part. Was indeed part of the conference, is a very important topic to make sure that all these systems are accessible and also understandable for all these people. With the move towards digitization, it doesn't become easier. I find it for myself quite difficult to understand, let alone for all the people who needs to make a use for all these systems. So it's also probably a call for the industry to look for solutions that are of course suitable for the majority groups, but also in particular for the groups which are more vulnerable.
Definitely, inclusion was high on the subject. One thing that I would have liked to see more of was the concept that identity, a risk-based approach to identity. We're still not thinking, we're thinking in a binary way that this is identity, it's either exists or doesn't exist. To me, identity is lots of gray, shades of gray. Any identity could be useful, but it may not be trusted, and maybe depending on what applications it is, the trust level rises and it starts to be applicable. We have to move away from the binary concept. And I didn't see much of discussion about risk-based identity. It's highly important related to trust, especially in a digital context, because for me, any identity is useful identity. And that ties into the inclusion aspect. Because if I could allow my population to just come in, self-declare or declare through a community center, may not be as reliable as receiving a $10,000 contract. But if I can give them $50 for a month to help them until I validate, there is value in that identity. And that's what governments need to start thinking about, the 50 shades of gray of identity. I don't know if that's a concept, but it is something that we have to start building towards. Because
I absolutely agree with that. I know the Ministry of Interior of the Netherlands has done a lot of work on that, on looking at the idea that identity is not absolute. Identity is relative. And I strongly believe that's the future of identity. So I'll just add my voice to that. Yes.
Mikhail, you wanna comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. And I can share maybe one of the questions that we are currently struggling with or addressing, and maybe also ask for help in the community with that.
That's great.
Is that relates obviously to the digital identity part, and yes, that is part of the individual. It's not a government task, but it's an individual task. But that raises the question: who is doing that on behalf of the individual, and what is the role of the government? Because in the end, it's a stakeholder game. There are people, or there are institutions who need to accept that identity. The person needs to control that identity, and probably the government needs to set up frameworks to allow that to happen. And there needs to be technology that makes it work, which is interoperable and vendor neutral, and maybe even open source. So the concept is clear, and we're moving towards that concept, but we are really looking into ways on how do we move forward with that in a practical manner with so many stakeholders.
Exactly. Great.